This is the Politics of Slavery, Element 1, about the Compromise of 1850 and how it contributed to the eventual Civil War of the 1860s. But in truth, if we're talking about the politics of slavery in American history, we actually have to go much farther back. I mean, you could go all the way back to the turn of the century in 1800 when the cotton industry and the whole King Cotton boom began. This is obviously going to carry well up to 1848 into the 1850s and on to the Civil War. So our starting point for this is going to be in 1820 with the Missouri Compromise promoted by this guy, Henry Clay. Now, just a reminder from prior lessons, Henry Clay is the one who came up with the American system. Henry Clay was the Secretary of State who supposedly made a corrupt bargain with John Quincy Adams to name him president, and Henry Clay would later be Secretary of State as well, running for president a couple of times himself. But the concentration here, once again, was the compromise that he promoted in 1820. Now, in 1820, the prime issue in the politics of slavery, if you want to call it that, was an issue of statehood, an issue that would continue well into the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, and into the Civil War of the 1860s. What I mean by that is every time you add a state, you are adding population to the United States. And you're also adding representatives to the U.S. House of Representatives. I mean, a new state has to be represented in Congress, after all. The problem here is that if you admit a state that is either totally free or totally slave, or at least favoring those things, then you are tipping the balance of power in Congress. For example, if you add a state that is a slave state, that they're all about slavery, they don't plan on changing it anytime soon, then you are also adding representatives to the U.S. House of Reps that would be in favor of slavery, and that would tip the balance of lawmaking power in favor of slave states. Same thing if you were to add a free state. It would tip the balance of power in favor of free states as well. So this became an issue right off the bat with the Missouri Compromise of 1820, and this is going to kick off this free state versus slave state issue for the next 40 some odd years. See, what happens in the Compromise of 1820 is pretty simple. Missouri was going to be added as a slave state. Now again, to keep the balance of power the same, Maine would therefore have to be added as a free state. That was the compromise, and nobody really seemed to have a tremendous problem with that. Where it got a little controversial was regarding this line here at 36 degrees 30 minutes latitude. This was the Missouri Compromise line, and it basically said that any territories that eventually became states, or just stayed territories, whatever the case may be, anything above that Missouri Compromise line up here could not have slaves. Now that's kind of odd because Missouri is above the 36 degree 30 minute line, but they were allowed to have slaves. Now, no matter what side of the argument you were on in this, it was something that was going to cause controversy. Tensions started to rise, and slavery would be a political issue for the next 45 years after the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Okay, back to where we left off with Element 3 on the Age of Jackson lesson. As you remember, by the time the election of 1848 rolled around, James K. Polk had decided he wasn't going to run for president again, even though he had greatly expanded the country in the 1840s. And it turned out that that was probably a pretty good thing, as James K. Polk ended up dying in 1849. That would have made for kind of a rough presidency. In any event, in the election of 1848, there were various nominees that wanted to come to the fore. The Whig candidate should have been Henry Clay, but ever since 1824 and the whole corrupt bargain thing, Clay, even though he was a career politician and widely known, remember, father of the American system, promoter of the Missouri Compromise, all these good things, that corrupt bargain of 1824 was still hanging over his head, and he had way too many enemies to actually get the nomination. So the nomination actually goes to Louisiana slave owner Zachary Taylor from the Whig Party, and he's up against Lewis Cass for the Democratic Party. In addition, another party wanted to get into the mix, the Anti-Slavery Free Soil Party. Once they formed, they did so because they distrusted both candidates. They didn't like Zachary Taylor from the Whigs or Lewis Cass from the Democrats. In the end, the Free Soilers didn't do much in the election. Zachary Taylor won the election 163 to 127 in the Electoral College, riding his popularity from having been a war hero in the Mexican War of 1848. I mean, the election is just a couple months after the Mexican War, so it kind of made sense. Okay, so Taylor is elected, and he's supposed to be president now from 1849 to 1853 at minimum, and possibly run for another term. But he's not going to make it. He's going to pass away before his first term concludes, and his vice president, Millard Fillmore, will end up taking over for him. More on Millard Fillmore in a little bit. But the reason I bring this up is because Zachary Taylor's death becomes really the deciding factor in one of the major pieces of legislation during the era of the politics of slavery, and that is the Compromise of 1850. Now, in this era of the politics of slavery, the Compromise of 1850 was just as controversial, if not more so, than the Missouri Compromise of 1820, 30 years earlier. Now, in this portrait that you see here, an elderly now Henry Clay is passionately debating about the Compromise of 1850, but we haven't even gotten into what makes it so controversial yet. See, the Compromise of 1850 was a response to Southern concerns about anti-slavery proposals that had come up in California, which was a territory at that time but was about to become a state. I mean, everybody saw the writing on the wall. California was about to be a state, and that would add a lot of anti-slavery representatives to the House of Reps. Now, Washington, D.C. was having heated debates about it in Congress as well. So the idea was that they were trying to come up with some way to let California be a state, which, it needed to be. I mean, if you remember from prior lessons in the gold rush of 1849, there was a lot of lawlessness in California, and they really wanted to be part of the United States to get federal assistance with some of the things that were happening out there. But here's the thing. The North wanted to save the Union through compromise. That was the biggest thing. The North wanted a compromise of some sort. The South, they didn't want any compromises on this particular issue, and they were willing to leave the Union if need be, if California was admitted as a free state with no slave states being added as well. Well, the Compromise of 1850 ended up happening to avoid a civil war, which would eventually happen 11 years later, but at least they had put it off. In the Compromise of 1850, California was admitted as a free state. Now, they still hadn't decided on another state to be added along with California to counteract that, but what they decided on instead was that slavery would be allowed in Washington, D.C., which sends a very strong political message about the direction of the nation and where it's going and what its views are, when some states don't have slavery, but it's allowed in your national capital. That was acceptable to Southerners, and so the Compromise of 1850 was about to go through. The problem was that Zachary Taylor was not in favor of it, but not for the reasons that you might expect. Remember that Zachary Taylor was from Louisiana, and he was a Southern slave owner, but he was also a Whig, which kind of made him anti-slavery, and he basically surprised everyone by saying California is going to be admitted as a free state. I don't particularly care what the South says about it. Now, that surprised everybody, like I said, but pretty soon he passed away. And after his death, Vice President Millard Fillmore becomes president and does sign the Compromise of 1850 into law. There were a lot of provisions about slavery measures in there, and Millard Fillmore felt like the Southern economy was far too important to antagonize by taking away their labor force. He also wasn't entirely sure it was constitutional to do so. So he signed it into law, taking the exact opposite course that Taylor had taken before him. Now, the Compromise of 1850, like I said, was a controversial bill, but one of the most controversial parts of the Compromise of 1850 was the Fugitive Slave Law, which was also known as the Bloodhound Bill. Now, again, this is part of the Compromise of 1850, and it's a response to Southern demands that the Underground Railroad to Canada be shut down. Now, this was one of the only reasons that Southern states agreed to the Compromise of 1850. If this had not been a part of it, then I doubt that Southern states would have agreed to it. But going back to prior lessons here, if you don't remember what the Underground Railroad was, it was basically a migrating network by Harriet Tubman trying to get slaves from the South to the freedom of Canada. They would help them escape, and they would have the slaves stop at various checkpoints where members of the quote-unquote Underground Railroad would safely keep them out of sight in attics or in basement chambers or all sorts of hidden rooms that they had in their houses and their barns or even tunnels in the ground. They would move at night and they would hide during the day, and eventually, after going through these various checkpoints from sympathetic people that would help them, they would get to Canada and be free. Well, southern states were sick of the Underground Railroad as they were losing their labor force, and again, they agreed to the Compromise of 1850 on the idea that the Fugitive Slave Law be in it. So what was the Fugitive Slave Law about? Well, it basically said that fleeing slaves cannot testify on their behalf, that they were now denied a jury trial, and anyone caught helping them escape could also be jailed. Now, ironically enough, this encouraged more people to join the abolition movement and help even more slaves get to Canada because they thought it was such a ridiculous law. Some northern governments even made it illegal to follow the Fugitive Slave Act, which upset southern governments even more. Now, as I said before, the North was completely furious with the law and made it clear that they weren't going to follow it, and like I said, they'd even made it illegal to follow the Fugitive Slave Law in some states. And you can imagine how the South felt about that. The South was furious with the Northern response. So this is, again, a controversial part of a controversial law that was passed, the Fugitive Slave Law that was part of the Compromise of 1850. The North is furious with the law, and the South is furious with the Northern response to the law. And on top of everything else, this is when Harriet Beecher Stowe released Uncle Tom's Cabin, about the life and times of a slave who was dealing with an oppressive master. Basically, public opinion, whether it be in the North and the South, was fueled greatly by this. Harriet Beecher Stowe even had a death threat on her life because of writing this book. Northerners who hated the Fugitive Slave Law were impassioned by the book. Southerners who were all about the Fugitive Slave Law were angered by the book. So once we get to the election of 1852, we are now once again in the middle of slavery as the main central focus of politics at that time. And the election of 1852 would also mark the end of the Whig Party. In the election of 1852, Winfield Scott, who was a Whig, was running against New Hampshire's Franklin Pierce, who was a Democrat. Now, Pierce was an alcoholic, but he was also a Northerner who supported Southern policies. And for that reason, Franklin Pierce wins in a landslide, 254 to 42 in the Electoral College. Again, he got Northern votes because he was a Northerner, but Southerners liked him as well because he favored some of their policies. Now, at this point, the Whigs, after such a brutal beating, are completely disorganized, with a split between the Southern Whigs and the Northern Whigs. Within a couple of years, the party itself would die out. Okay, that's it. Thanks for listening.